Senator Kerr.
Thank you very much, Mr Acting Deputy President. And I rise to add my contribution to the debate on the Treasury Laws Amendment, making sure every state and territory gets their fair share of GST Bill 2018. And my contribution won't be as colourful as Senator Leyonhjelm's, but I do want to make it very clear at the outset that Labor does support this bill, but we do so with quite some degree of reservation. And my reservations centre on three key points. Firstly, the arbitrary nature of the Commonwealth's decision to introduce this legislation, while questions from the states and territories still remain unanswered. Second, the complete lack of transparency from this coalition government about how it intends to fund the top-up policy that this legislation introduces. And third, the likelihood that this untrustworthy government won't make good on its commitment not to cut other crucial funding to states and territories. Health or education funding, national partnership funding agreements on housing and early childhood education and care could all be at risk under a government that changes its mind and its Prime Minister at the whim of the polls. And I will come back to these points shortly. I also want to point out that it is Labor that has led the way when it comes to GST reform. It was Labor who listened to the concerns of the states and territories and took them seriously. And it's Labor who took on board the plight of Western Australia, and that it was not only due to the financial mismanagement of the Liberal Barnett government, although that was a key factor, but also because of the effect of the time lag in the current method of GST distribution, which meant a drop in Western Australia's share coincided with a sudden economic downturn, significantly affecting the state's ability to balance the books. And that's why Labor announced the Fair Share for WA Fund, a fund designed to bring Western Australia up to the equivalent of 70 cents in the GST dollar. And during the course of the Senate Economics Committee, Legislation Committee inquiry into this bill, the Premier of Western Australia, Mr McGowan, attended, as Senator Lyons has indicated, and he made it very clear that he thought that the Labor announcement of the Fair Share for WA Fund was a game changer in ensuring that there was a positive outcome for Western Australia. But there was a policy vacuum in this area. The government wasn't coming to the party, and so it fell to Labor to come forward with a tangible policy response. And Mr Shorten and Federal Labor did that to a long acknowledged problem. Contrary to what the Coalition subsequently proposed, the Fair Share for WA Fund was structured to ensure other states and territories would not see any reduction in their GST funding. And I'm a senator from Queensland, so it's very important for me that whilst we would like to see Western Australia dealt with fairly, we certainly don't want to see any reduction in funding for Queenslanders, particularly given the fact that Queensland is a decentralised state. And once the Coalition came to the party on GST reform, Labor fought for and won a 7-year guarantee that no state or territory would be worse off under the new funding arrangements. This important Labor achievement is one of the key reasons that I will be voting for this bill. So let me just now outline for the benefit of those listening or watching what this bill is proposing to do. It largely responds to a report from the Productivity Commission inquiry into horizontal fiscal equalisation, a report that recommended changes to the method of distribution of the GST in recognition that the current method of distribution is sometimes disadvantageous, particularly in the case of economic shocks in our economy and particularly in the case of Western Australia in recent times. To change the method of GST distribution, this bill amends the Commonwealth Grants Commission Act 1973 and the Federal Financial Relations Act 2009 to transition our current system of full horizontal fiscal equalisation, or HFE, to a system of reasonable equalisation, which means equalising to the stronger performing state of New South Wales and Victoria. It goes on to introduce a minimum GST revenue sharing relativity, or GST relativity floor, that may be determined by the Treasurer for any individual state or territory, and it also permanently boosts the GST revenue pool with additional Commonwealth financial assistance. The bill also provides for measures during the transition period, including payments to be made to any state or territory with a GST revenue sharing relativity below a relativity factor of 0.7 or 70 cents in the dollar, later moving to 0.75. Payments to be made to the Northern Territory if its GST revenue sharing relativity falls below its determined relativity factor for 2017-18, and a guarantee that each state and territory will get the better of the current distribution system or the updated distribution system during the transition period. In addition, the explanatory memorandum to the bill provides that the Productivity Commission will be required to conduct an inquiry at the end of the transition period, and additional Commonwealth funding under the new method of distribution and top-up arrangements will be nearly $9 billion over 10 years. I'd like to just go back and look at the history of the GST reform, and just for the benefit of those listening, we will recall that the GST was introduced in the year 2000 by the then Prime Minister, Mr Howard. Although people listening might recall hearing the following comments made by Mr Howard before he was elected in 1995, where he said, "There's no way a GST will ever be part of our policy. Never, ever. It's dead." After being elected, the Liberals changed their tune, with Mr Howard describing... President, I was recounting the history of the GST legislation. I mentioned that the GST was first introduced in 2000, but we know that Mr Howard, the former Prime Minister, indicated in 1995 that there was no way a GST will ever be part of our policy. Never, ever. It's dead. But we know that after he was elected, the Liberals changed their tune, with Mr Howard describing the GST in the year 2000 as something the country has needed for more than 20 years. So this, of course, this issue goes to the heart of our concerns about this government's propensity to backflip on its promises. And the Liberal Party has more form on changing the mind in relation to the GST. During the 2013 election campaign, Mr Abbott said this: "Let me be as categoric as I can. The GST won't change. Full stop. End of story. Can only change if all the states and the territories agree." And yet, here we are debating coalition's changes to the GST that the states and territories have reservations about. And the letter from the Treasurer of Queensland makes it quite clear that this is a unilateral change by the Commonwealth. Now, the reservations that we've expressed stem partly from the fact that the new arrangements mean that while states and territories not performing as well economically as the stronger of New South Wales or Victoria will be topped up, those who outperform the benchmark will keep their surplus funds, which means that there will need to be more money to distribute, hence the need for an injection of Commonwealth funds to the overall GST money pool. And other reservations of the states and territories centre around the ministerial discretion in decision-making written into this legislation. And there are still questions to be answered by the coalition. Where's the money coming from? How will the new system address economic volatility? What is proposed after the 7-year guarantee that no state or territory will be worse off expires? What will the terms of reference be for the Productivity Commission review? And will the states and territories be guaranteed input into that process? Questions that I hoped would be answered when the Senate Economics Legislation Committee, of which I'm the Deputy Chair, inquired into this bill last month. Now, that committee received evidence from all states and territories and the Treasury, along with the Minerals Council of Australia, Rio Tinto, the Institute of Public Affairs, the Chamber of Commerce and Industry WA, and the Chamber of Minerals and Energy of Western Australia, through a public submission process and through a public hearing in Canberra. There was evidence, particularly from Western Australia business and resource groups, that the proposed change in distribution method would encourage states and territories to work harder to develop their own economies in order to retain a greater share of the benefits, if outperforming the benchmark state. There was evidence from other states and territories that the current system of HFE is adequate, not broken, and in some cases, in the case of the South Australian submission, the argument that it should be retained. Now, Labor senators made additional comments in relation to that Senate inquiry report that echo the reservations that I've outlined to the Senate. We pointed out that once again the coalition dragged its feet on an important financial reform, and once again it took Labor action through announcing our policy to get the government moving. It was Labor who announced that we would legislate a floor for GST relativities, action that was eventually copied by the Morrison government in July, when they said there's no need to do that. That was in the committee report. Because the flip-flopping marketing man, our new Prime Minister Morrison, soon recognised that Labor was right. Just as we were right to fight for the no state worse off guarantee to be enshrined in legislation. Another element initially rejected by the Morrison government, with new Treasurer Frydenberg suggesting that administration costs would be too high. And I note from the report that Mr Frydenberg said, and I quote, "Because what some of the states are wanting us to do is to run two parallel systems. They're wanting us to run an old set of books based on what is the current system and a new set of books, which is based on the new system with the floor and the additional $9 billion. So, based on that, the Treasurer had previously expressed his opposition to the no state worse off guarantee. But it was only a week until Mr Frydenberg flip-flopped his way back to Labor's position, a position quite vocally shared by the states and territories. So it's clear that only Labor can stand up for the states and territories when it comes to unfair coalition legislation. And we echo their call for transparency around the top-up funding, where that will come from. We want to know how this government, that's consistently big on headlines, thought bubbles, and short on detail, intends to find the $9 billion that they are promising to top up the funding pool. Labor shares the real concerns of the states and territories about whether other funding sources will be cut to offset the Commonwealth contribution to the GST pool. That's why Labor senators recommended in our additional comments to the committee's report, and I quote, that the letter from the Federal Treasurer to the state and territory treasurers stating that any additional financial assistance referred to in the bill will not be offset or partially offset by a decrease in other grant funding to the states be tabled during the parliamentary debate. And I'm grateful that Minister Cormann did provide that letter, I believe, tabled that yesterday, and so I see that we have a letter from the Treasurer to the Treasurer of Queensland, and I just want to read into the Hansard I think the very important commitment, and it is, I also confirm that any additional financial assistance referred to in the bill will not be offset or partially offset by a decrease in other grant funding to the states. So that I think goes some way to addressing some of the concerns that we have. Now, a number of the states and territories made reference to this letter in their evidence. And in my home state of Queensland, the state government submission said this: the Australian Treasurer gave assurances in his letter to the Deputy Premier and during the second reading in Parliament that the updated system will not be to the detriment of other payments to states. However, this is not reflected in the bill or the explanatory memorandum. The bill and explanatory memorandum should be amended to require that pool top-up and additional financial assistance will not come at the expense of other payments to the states. So I do want to just take a minute or two just to look at the Queensland government submission. So I think it, for Queenslanders, it highlights some of the concerns that we have. We know that Queensland has the most decentralised population of all the Australian states and is uniquely exposed to arbitrary changes to the GST system, which when we abandoned the principle of full HFE. So this is reflected in the Queensland Government submission. The system that we've had has meant that Queensland has received less than its population share of GST revenue in some years and more than its share depending on the economic circumstances. Queensland is particularly exposed in relation to this matter because the GST revenue for Queensland in 2018-19 represents about 1/4 of the state's total revenue. So we really need to get this issue right. And despite promises of consultation, I'm referring to the Queensland Government submission here, they said that despite promises of consultation and opposition from states to proposed changes, the Morrison government introduced this bill in October, and the bill will permanently change the system of distributing GST revenue. Now, the Palaszczuk government, in its submission, acknowledged that the government has taken, as I said, a unilateral decision to amend the legislation. The Queensland Government does welcome the recent amendments to the bill, in particular the No State Will Be Worse Off guarantee, the Productivity Commission inquiry, but there are still some concerns, and the Queensland Government made 7 recommendations which I think are all eminently sensible. One of the things that I was concerned about in relation to the revised GST arrangements is that under the government's preferred model in the year 2023-24, Queensland was going to be the only state over the transition period that would be financially disadvantaged in comparison to the existing arrangements. So during the course of the Senate hearing, I sought clarification from Treasury officials, and they made it very clear that the no worse off guarantee applies to individual years over the course of that transition period. And I just quote from Ms Phipps from the Hansard, where she said that we would look at what the difference was between what a particular jurisdiction had got over the course of the previous years under the updated system, and if in the example Queensland gave they were $100 million worse off in 2023-24, but were $80 million better off in the updated system across the years prior to that, then the top-up would be $20 million to make sure that in that year Queensland was cumulatively in the better of the two systems better off. And so it's been clarified that those top-up payments do occur within the transition period. So, as I've said, we certainly forgive the states and territories, and particularly Queensland, for its cynicism or scepticism about this issue. My home state has been the victim of vicious coalition cuts at both the state and federal levels, devastating cuts to health and education. In most recent times, we've had the Newman government that sacked 14,000 workers, and we've seen cuts at a federal level to public hospitals and penalty rates and less apprentices. So we know that it's Labor that's done the hard yards on economic management. We've announced hundreds of policies in the lead up to the federal election. Our policies are researched and they're costed. We're absolutely upfront about where the money's coming from with our election commitments. And I want to conclude today by mentioning some of the points that Shadow Treasurer Mr Bowen has written about in an opinion piece. Mr Bowen has said, you can trust us with the economy, because on this side of the chamber we take a holistic approach to economic growth encompassing tax, infrastructure, connectivity, entrepreneurialism, foreign policy, and most importantly, investment in human capital. While the Coalition cancels COAG and prioritises campaign but not campaign bus trips and covert fundraising efforts, Labor is getting on with the job. We are developing the policies Australia needs to prepare for the future and to bring back the fair go. Labor is stable and united. Labor has listened to the Australian people. We have the policies and the drive. Labor is ready